So, as usual, welcome to this next part. We're looking at scene 2 and 3 of Act 2, and we're getting into some of the nitty gritty as the story will start progressing at a faster pace at this point. I invite you, if you haven't, as usual, to go ahead and read the script or to follow along with the audiobook and then come back for the review here. Now, I know that there's going to be a challenge. You're going to be trying to pick up on what's going on. There are a lot of lines exchanged, and a lot of them are kind of encoded. What is going on? But if you can listen and get the gist of kind of what's going on and sort of interpret the text for yourself, and then come back to this video to get the idea of what you've just read, that will help you more navigate the play more independently as we go on and on. So make sure you read it, try to understand it, let your brain hurt, and then come back to this and see the review. So we're going to summarize scene 2 here. So what's happening in scene 2? Well, it starts with Romeo. He sees Juliet come out on the balcony. Romeo then realizes that he had jumped into Juliet's back garden, where he heard Juliet talking about him. So we remember in the scene prior, he jumps over this wall to avoid his friends. Well, it turns out he jumps into the Capulets' orchard or their yard or whatever, their garden. So he jumps into the Capulets' property. All right. Juliet says up from her room balcony that she loved Romeo, but he was a Montague. She said some of these famous lines. A rose by any other word would smell as sweet, or by any other name would smell as sweet. She thought if Romeo stopped being a Montague, their relationship just might work. So she had already identified that he is a Montague, that he is an enemy, and that his name is the only problem with their love or potential love, because he's her worst enemy, and likewise, she's his worst enemy. Now, Romeo's down there listening for quite some time until he can't stand it any longer. He speaks, and he makes himself known. He speaks to Juliet and tells her that he heard everything she said and that he loves her too. She had already professed her love for him. He goes and is asked to profess his love for her, and he heard her say it without her knowing that he was there. So he kind of eavesdrops on her kind of secret conversation with herself. Now, this is one of those interesting scenes. It's kind of like a soliloquy, yet it's not. It's a unique thing Shakespeare's doing. Remember, soliloquy is when a character is speaking to themselves on stage. Well, Juliet is speaking to herself on stage, therefore it's a soliloquy. However, it's unique because nobody else is supposed to hear the soliloquy except the audience. But in this scene, Romeo overhears it. So there's Shakespeare using kind of some cool tools creatively as a playwright in making his play. And Romeo overhears Juliet there. Now, it progresses quite fast. We'll take a look at some of the lines here in a minute. As it says up here, this whole scene is like the most important scene up to this point. Most famous scene up to this point. Probably the most famous scene other than the closing scene of the story. It's really important. Romeo and Juliet speak some of Shakespeare's most famous lines in this scene. So we want to pay attention to what happens next. It's almost unbelievable how the scene concludes. And oh yeah, this scene is known as the balcony scene. And that brings me to this. Remember our Globe Theater? Okay. Now, if you look up there, you see that there's actually a second floor, a balcony. Okay. You got our main stage, right? Yay. And then up there is our balcony. So we actually get to use the cool Globe Theater balcony in this play. And Juliet's up there. Romeo's on the garden on the main stage below. And it is therefore then a balcony scene where Juliet appears in another level, a little bit higher. So very, very cool. Okay, before leaving the balcony, before departing for the night, Juliet asks Romeo if he thought they should get married. And Romeo tells her that he'll let her know later in the day. And they arrange to send word by 9 the next morning. So now there's no cue that they kiss, but often this is depicted as Romeo climbing the balcony, them kissing and kissing goodnight, and then Juliet going inside as summoned by the nurse. All right. Now there's this comment here, changing name. How would changing his name help? Well, the only thing he'd have to do is change his name. If he did not have the last name Montague, he'd be totally fine to marry her. And maybe that's the only thing preventing him from being married to her or from pursuing a relationship. Same thing with her. Just change your name, right? Well, it's not easier said than done. You can't just change the name of a plant like a rose and call it something else. Yes, it still remains a rose. It still has all its properties. It smells like a rose. It has thorns, whatever. Beautiful. It still has all those properties of a rose, but you might call it a dandelion. Well, okay, you could do that, but it's still a rose, right? Even if you change Romeo's name, he's still Romeo Montague. He's not going to be Romeo Smith. Now, lastly, married. We should be shocked here because, by the end of the scene, they ask, "Oh, you love me, I love you." Oh, okay. If your love is true, then let me know you'll marry me. And it's kind of Juliet who spurs this move to get him to make wedding arrangements, with which Romeo goes off to do excitedly. All right. What's she thinking? They've only known each other for a few hours, if that. They have spoken a couple hundred words to each other? All they've said to one another essentially is, "You're beautiful, and I love you," essentially. And because of that, they think that they're suddenly ready for marriage. Keep in mind, that very morning, when Paris, I should say 24 hours earlier or so, not quite, when Paris asked for Juliet's hand in marriage, and Juliet's given that news, she says, "Marriage is something that I have not thought of too much yet. I don't know if I'm quite ready yet." And suddenly, ironically, she is ready. Hey, when you meet the right guy, I guess you're ready. Okay, that's scene 2. It's the balcony scene. We'll go over some of those lines in a second. And then we come upon scene 3, Act 2, scene 3. Here comes the bride. Why? Because the wedding arrangements are made in this scene. Okay, let's review this one, summarize this one. It's a little bit more complicated as to what is going on, because we do change locations. Let's check it out. So Romeo hasn't even gone to bed. We know he runs straight to his friend Friar Lawrence, and this is the first time we see Friar Lawrence. He couldn't believe, Romeo couldn't believe that Juliet loved him back and wanted to marry him, so he's going to jump on that opportunity. Romeo runs straight to the friar to see if he would marry him. That was his plan. Now, in the meantime, as Romeo's transitioning there, the friar's already awake early in the morning, so that's why we know it's early in the morning, and he's actually outside gardening. He's got this huge spiel at the beginning, which I would have narrated quite a bit more in depth, but I'm not going to. But in any case, he was outside picking herbs or plants and talking about them. And because it was so early in the morning, the friar thought Romeo had been out all night with Rosaline. He accuses Romeo with not sleeping and not being in bed, and thinks, "Oh, you've been hanging out with Rosaline all night," which would have been bad or improper. Okay, they're not married, and they have curfews or whatever, so they shouldn't be hanging out. So he was going to discipline Romeo. By the way, he's a spiritual mentor and a mentor, a figure who can direct Romeo, give him advice, and seems to know all about his backstory with Rosaline and all that. So he's a very knowledgeable person with Romeo and Romeo's character, and a trustworthy old guy. All right. Reminder here: a friar is like a priest, pastor, minister, rabbi, bishop. He's a monk. Okay. He's a monk. Now, this one happens to be a priest monk. A priest can marry people. A priest can hear confessions. A priest can be a spiritual guide or a director. And that's what the friar is for Romeo. So Romeo then tells the friar that, "No, I wasn't with Rosaline. I went to this party and I feasted with my enemy," he says, Juliet. He meets Juliet, and he says that they desire to get married. Okay. The friar could hardly believe his ears. It wasn't Rosaline, but it was Juliet, who is a Capulet. Okay, the Capulet heir. And this is shocking news to him, for one, because Romeo changes his love so quickly. We'll take a look at some of those lines. And it's also shocking because the friar's toying with this idea, gee, if these two enemies do love each other and they've set aside the feud, then maybe from here on in, Verona, by the union of these two people, could actually have a feudless existence between the Montagues and Capulets. So Romeo is able to convince the friar that his love for Juliet was different, and it was true, and it could end in marriage because, from Rosaline, because Rosaline didn't love him back. Rosaline knew that Romeo was kind of perhaps superficial in his love and didn't love him back. Whereas Juliet does love him back and loves him back truly. And in the end, reluctantly, but with the hope of mending the feud, as I mentioned, the friar agrees to marry Romeo and Juliet. However, the clincher is this: it's not some big public wedding. He plans to do it in secret. And so they kind of elope, I guess, in a sense. They make this arrangement. They want to get married quickly. He agrees. He's going to marry them, he says. And it'll be done in secret. And then I don't really know what his plan beyond that is. I think if you're the friar that says, I just married Romeo and Juliet, the two feuding heirs, family's worst enemies, that's probably not going to go over well, but in any case. Now, going back to what the friar is doing, this is important because Shakespeare is setting us up to know the expertise of the friar. He, as we mentioned, when we were looking at our character analysis, is that the friar is really good with herbs. He knows plants, he knows their potency, their power for good and their power for evil. And the fact that the earth gives forth these plants for humans to know and experiment with, to know their properties and what they can do. So they can heal and they can poison. And so his idea or his knowledge of plants is going to be very important to the rest of the story. And we've already discussed this. What's the friar thinking by agreeing to this? Do you think his decision to marry the two star-crossed lovers was the right decision? We come to start asking questions about the decisions of these characters, and did they make the right choice? Or are all these decisions from here on in affecting the direction of the play towards its tragic ending? Absolutely. So the friar here deciding to marry them is something that is one of the things that starts the characters on this path of tragedy. Okay? Very good. Now, let's go ahead and look at my top lines. Please pardon me, there are quite a few because it's such a prominent scene. So let's get right into that. Woo! So here we are, Act 2, Scene 2. A lot of lines exchanged by two characters, Romeo and Juliet here. So let's analyze a few of them here. First one I want to go is this one here, right at the beginning. Now remember, Romeo's in their garden. He sees Juliet come out on the balcony, and what he says is, "It's the east, Juliet's the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon." And it's nighttime, so as Juliet comes out on the balcony from the east, as it's if the sun is rising and outshining the light of the moon. This is a reference, or constant references, of Romeo referencing Juliet's beauty as radiant, as illuminating. And in this case, she's as fair as the sun, as radiant as the sun, so that even when she comes out on the balcony at night, the moon is completely overwhelmed by the radiance or the beauty of Juliet. This is part of the artistic language of Shakespeare when it comes to kind of really describing the beauty of somebody. And he will use this kind of poetic language. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon. And he compares Juliet's radiance to the light and brilliance of the sun. Now, she doesn't know he says this. He's eavesdropping at this point. So the next line we'll go down to is around the 20 area here. There. Here's another funny reference. I wasn't going to say this line, but again, the birds would sing and think it were not night. When did the birds start singing? When the sun rises, right? So he's saying, oh, Juliet's out, and the birds are going to start singing because they're going to think it's daytime. Okay, another reference to her beauty and radiant beauty. But I do want to point out this line here. Now he's watching her. See how she leans her cheek upon her hand. She's leaning on the balcony, railing perhaps. And she's daydreaming, like people do. And he says, oh, that I were a glove on that hand, that I might touch that cheek. Okay, very cheesy. He wants to be near her. He wants to, have any excuse to be right next to her, just like young lovers love to do, is to be together. And he wishes he were a glove. That way he could enjoy that closeness to her, not only being in contact with her hand, but also that tender hand upon her cheek. Okay, Very cheesy. He wants to be a glove. Okay. We go down to next line 43 or so. There it is. So Juliet then begins speaking to herself, and she says stuff like this. And we kind of reference this in our summary. What's in a name? She says, that which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Okay. So would Romeo, were he not Romeo called. So if Romeo was called George Smith, okay, then it wouldn't be a problem. But he'd still have all the charm of Romeo. Physical charm, verbal charm, character charm. You just have a different name. So very important, famous line of Shakespeare. That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. So if we called a rose a dandelion and the rose still had all the attributes of a rose, it would still smell beautiful. It would still be a wonderful, beautiful flower, even if we called it a dandelion. What would we know the difference? Anyways, I sometimes wonder who gave these names to the different things that we have names for in our language. Okay, next one is about 86 or so. We already jumping down there. We keep scrolling. Eventually, they make each other known and they begin speaking. Okay, right here. Else would a maiden blush, bepaint my cheek, for that which thou hast heard me speak tonight. She is embarrassed that Romeo was there listening to her speak about him, about her love for him. She was talking very intimately about her inner thoughts about him, about being in love with him. How would you feel if you kind of met somebody they were so wonderful and you went to just speak your heart out about them without thinking they're there and they're actually listening to you? Or maybe you said something and you didn't realize that the person you were talking about was right behind you or something like that. And then they're right there and you're like embarrassed because they overheard what you had to say that you wanted really to keep a secret. Okay. So she is embarrassed, and I just wanted to point that out. Now, she has already said she loves him, and she, a little later on, wants to hear Romeo say that he loves her. Okay? And then we go to line 143. We scroll down. I'm still looking at the lines here in the margin, and quite a ways down here. Okay. Now we get to the nitty-gritty here. If that thy bent, if that thy purpose or thy objective is of love, be honorable. So if you are loving honorably, truly, okay, you don't just want to use me, you don't just think I'm beautiful, you don't just want to, experience love and dump me and find somebody else. So if your love is true, then thy purpose must be marriage. Send me word tomorrow about wedding arrangements. So this is Juliet's way of knowing if Romeo is really, really, truly in love. Okay? If he just wants to use her, if he just wants to break her heart and move on to somebody else, then that's what his objective will be. But if he really, really, really loves her, then what would the end of that look like? Okay? And if you love somebody, typically, I think we value this less and less today, sadly. If you love somebody, we typically think that ends in public marriage, where you have that public union with that person as a married couple. Okay, now that's the ultimate purpose then of dating people, is to find out, is that person a good fit for me to be married to someday? And so I mean, and I would say that this is really neat, because these two young people in the story know that if you love somebody, then eventually you court or you woo one another with the purpose of being married someday. And this is also in a time where arranged marriages kind of forced you to perhaps appreciate and fall in love or accept that person so that you could marry them. In this case, it's not an arranged marriage, and they're really pursuing marriage in a kind of a fairy tale way, one that says, that invites kind of the idea of true love and following true love. Okay, so very neat. It goes very drastic, and we might be like, Yeah, we might be like, oh, that's a little too fast, guys. You're thinking about marriage already? You've just met. Well, I would say this. If the at the very now, I don't say you have to travel this quickly, but if in the back of your mind, you don't think that you would marry that person, then why would you ever date them in the first place? Okay, isn't the point of romance? Isn't the point of a dating relationship to find a spouse? Okay, in my opinion, it is. Okay, and I'm certainly back in the day. I was not going to go and date some girl I couldn't picture myself married to someday. Okay, that was always in the back of my mind. Even though the first lines I said to that girl might not have been, "Hey, want to date because I think that we could be married someday." I mean, you would never say that, but in the back of your mind, it should be asking the question: Could I see with myself with this person forever? And if the answer is no, then what the heck are you doing in that relationship? Okay. And you might be like, oh, I'm too young. Okay. If you're too young to think about, should I be dating that person or not? Can I be with them forever or not? Then maybe you're too young to be dating. Because I think sometimes we get into relationships nowadays so young, and it's just the cultural thing to do, to have a boyfriend because it's popular or something, or to have a girlfriend, right? Because then it's popular. Okay. Well, that's the wrong reason. That's the wrong reason. I like, at least in this story, how these two young teenagers got the idea right. They're only going to date. They're only going to date because they have true love for each other, and that they have kind of this in the back of their minds, the idea of love being on the purpose of marriage. Keep that in mind, right? If if you're not ready to think about marriage, you're probably doing more harm in dating, perhaps. Okay, especially when we're young. Man, I remember back in like grade 7, my classmates would go out on dates. They would start getting girlfriends and whatever, going to movies and whatever. And I was like, what are you even doing? I mean, what are you even doing? There's so much time between now and when you're actually going to be ready for marriage. It was just kind of peer pressure and some school culture to have a boyfriend when you were in grade 7. I was like, what the heck? Okay. Next thing we talk about is line 156. What is this one? These are all surprises to me. Okay. This is just to show you 155. Tomorrow will I send. Okay. Juliet intends to send a messenger to Romeo to get word onto what arrangements he's made. Now Romeo's free to kind of gallivant around the countryside. Juliet, probably not so much. She tends to spend most of her life in her house, enclosed and protected and safe. She doesn't just wander around Verona freely. I think if she had, Romeo may have seen her by then. Romeo does wander around Verona freely. Seems Juliet's very protected and kind of lives within her own mansion and whatever. So she depends on Romeo to make these arrangements. Okay, and then 180. Is this the funny one? I hope I mentioned the funny one. Yeah, it is. Okay, the nurse calls Juliet out a couple times, and Romeo stays. And again, they have this hard time saying goodbye to one another, and they have a hard time saying goodbye or good night or leaving one another. And so Juliet keeps coming out, and Romeo is still waiting there just to hear her. All right, I like this idea here. And yet, no further than a wanton's bird who lets it hop a little from her hand, like a poor prisoner in his twisted gyves, and with a silking thread plucks it back again, so loving, jealous of his liberty. And then Romeo says, I would I were thy bird. And this is a reference to this idea that, a spoiled child gets a bird. And if you got a bird, like a dove or something like that, you would tie a string to its foot, and then it kind of became your pet or a toy. Now, it's not like it would have any affections for you as a pet, but you could let it fly around on the string and tug it back whenever you wanted it. And it seems kind of cruel, but you could tie a string on the foot and let it flap around, and give it a tug, and end up with a bag in your hand. And she's saying, "Oh, I wish, Romeo, you were my bird, my wanton bird, and I would tie a string around you, and whenever I want you back, I would give you a pluck, okay, and pull you back again." And Romeo doesn't go like, I don't want to be your bird. Like, I appreciate freedom. Like, That's terrible. That's such animal cruelty, blah, blah, blah. He says, I would thy bird. I wish I could be your bird. If only. That would be awesome. Okay? So you can see that love maybe is blind because it makes you respond kind of in stupid ways. Okay, I'm glad I said that one. So anyway, that sums up the top lines of this scene. There are so many more. I wish we could have gone through it a little bit more in depth. But what we know right away is that Romeo is going to run off to Friar Lawrence. So let's jump over to the next scene. So let's review a few lines from Act 2, Scene 3 now. Obviously, we start with Friar Lawrence, who has a basket, and he's out in the garden commenting and picking herbs. Okay, now we're going to jump down quite a bit here to about line 60. Here it is. So Romeo eventually gets to the fact, and that is this. My love is set on the fair daughter of rich Capulet. Hers is set on mine, and you must combine us in holy marriage. You must unite us in holy marriage. Okay? He gets right to the point. That's what he comes to Friar Lawrence to ask him to do. Friar Lawrence is a priest. He has the power to marry two people, and so he seems to be a good friend of Romeo, and that's what Romeo comes to tell Friar Lawrence to do. Now, a little bit soon here, right away here, okay, Friar Lawrence reacts to this as, holy moly, didn't you just love Rosaline? Okay, so soon forgotten? He accuses this. Young men's love then lies not truly in their hearts, but in their eyes. If you can be so quick to be healed from your love sickness, remember how sick Romeo was not too long, like a day before, about Rosaline, moping and depressed? Okay, if you can flip on a dime, then love isn't in your heart, it's in your eyes, man. Because heartbrokenness doesn't just fix like that. Okay? And then he accuses young men of loving immaturely. Again, this is theme of, is love just physical? Is love just based on physical beauty? Well, for a lot of young men, possibly yes. And that's kind of an interesting line Friar Lawrence recognizes. You, Romeo, your love lies just in your eyes, not in your heart. You only see beauty. You don't see beyond physical beauty. Okay, I like that line. Part of one of the themes to analyze is what is true love and what does love consist of. Okay, again, line 75. Lo, here upon your cheek, Romeo, is a stain that doth sit of a tear that was not washed off yet. The tears that Romeo was wasting with Rosaline are still dried up on his cheeks. Now, it's not literal, it's poetic. It's kind of cool to say. You know, those tears that you were crying yesterday morning, they're still dried up, unwashed off your face. Okay, that's how fresh your moping is from Rosaline, and yet you're already deciding to like Juliet just on the, flip of a coin. And then we go to line 94 here. Ish is right here. Because Friar Lawrence hesitates. He says, no, your love is swapped too quickly. I'm not going to marry you. Okay. But then he thinks about it and he hesitates and he realizes, no, you know what? Maybe I will marry, because your alliance, this marriage may turn your household's hostility okay, to pure love. In other words, it might end the feud. Okay. And Romeo says, hurry. And Friar Lawrence says, wisely and slow, they stumble that run fast. In other words, let's take our time in this matter. If you go too fast, you'll stumble, you'll fail. Okay? Again, this is foreshadowing, and it's also an irony because Friar Lawrence is advising slowness. He's advising not to go so fast. If you go too fast, you're going to stumble, you're going to fall, and you'll fail. The ironic thing is the last thing these characters do is act slowly. They all act in haste. They all act within, right away, immediately. Okay, patience, patience. Love takes time to nurture. Okay, love takes time to discern and to think about and to wonder about. Okay, it's not always right off the bat that you just know. In fact, it might as well take that extra caution and take it a little bit more slowly. It's always to be safer than sorry, as we are doing in these times of kind of our pandemic protocol is just to be safer than sorry. Maybe you don't want to go too fast, you may stumble. And I think that love is a lot the same way. Okay, take it easy. Now that's our lines from these two scenes. Hopefully you enjoyed that. A little bit more lengthy, but we're getting now into some of the most famous scenes and progression of the plot line in this story. So I invite you, of course, to like and subscribe, comment if you want, but most importantly, don't be lame, DBL, and we'll see you next time.